Hello, I'm Omni Adams. You can find me on the Twitter at OmniColor. Check my blog, though I almost never update it. Feel free to update or email me if you have any questions after the talk that you don't feel like doing in a public forum. You can also please rate the talk when we're done, all of you. A few things about the talk. I am going to put the slides up somewhere. Probably on my personal website, although I may put them somewhere else as well. I'm trying to be funny in a lot of cases. It's okay to laugh. I imagine most of my humor is going to fall flat since there's 3 people in the audience. If you're easily offended, this may not be the best talk for you. I've tried to clean it up as much as possible, but I have been known to be a little bit rough around the edges. Feel free to ask questions. And don't be scared by this large number in the lower right here.
I think it goes pretty fast.
I go through some, yeah, you've seen them all. So I specialize in lazy development. Well, what is lazy development? Well, lazy development lets you get back to what's important in your life, like petting your cat, or taking a nap, or petting your cat while he takes a nap. Phing is my tool of choice for doing things as lazy as possible. Turns out that computers are really good at repetition. So once I do something one time, I try to automate it and let the computer repeat it again and again and again. So hopefully you've all heard the acronym DRY. Don't repeat yourself. Let me say that again. Do not repeat yourself. If you find yourself doing a task more than once, or you're looking up command line flags, or having trouble remembering how to actually run a command, even more than once, it's a good candidate for automation. So I like to start small with Phing and build things up as you go. So we're going to try to automate something that you do all the time. Y'all run unit tests?
Sometimes.
If you're not very good at doing unit tests, you definitely need to be at Chris Hargis's talk later today, as well as the closing keynote. So we're going to start with Phing trying to run PHP unit. So there's a really simple build.xml file. At the top, you're going to see you have all your XML stuff. The most important thing that you're going to see here is the target. Now, targets in Phing are what encapsulates all the stuff that you're going to do. So they can do logic, they can set variables, or they can run executables. In this case, we have one task within there called exec, and that exec runs PHP unit. So at the top, you see the standard XML stuff. Phing is all enterprisey and uses XML for
the ant build script.
It's, if you're familiar with ant, actually, I'm getting to that. So it could be worse, it could be Java, because Phing is a very close port of Apache Ant. Almost everything in it looks very, very similar. However, if you're familiar with Ant, there are some case differences in some of the attributes that will drive you absolutely crazy if you try to switch back and forth between them. The other big difference is instead of ant call, you use Phing call, because they're clever like that. When I started using Phing, I did switch back and forth and realized I needed to just pick one. And since I'm not a Java programmer, Phing made sense. The big difference is if you're trying to extend it and write custom tasks, you're running in PHP rather than Java. And
So you don't need Java to run it?
No, you don't need Java to run it. It's all native PHP. So you have the project tag that surrounds your tasks. I'm going to leave these out of all the future slides because they just take up space and don't really mean anything. They're not very important to us, but just pretend they're always there. And then you have your actual target tag. This is what you're going to call from the command line to run a target. We're going to cover this in a whole lot of depth and talk about a lot of different things that you can do with it. And finally, you have the exec tag that does the actual work. This is called a task in Phing terminology. There's a whole lot of fancy pre-built tasks that can do all kinds of stuff. You can also write your own, and we're going to talk about writing a custom task as well. I use exec for a lot of things because I'm a very command line oriented person, so doing things from the command line just makes sense to me. And with exec, you can run pretty much anything that you can run in a shell script. Again, we're doing PHP unit here. There is a native PHP unit task, but it is pretty limited. And talk a little bit about how it's limited and why I like to do it from an exec instead. So now if you drop to the command line and run a Phing test, it'll run your task. And you'll see the familiar PHP unit stuff in the middle there. You can see we've got all the dots from all of our tests, and it's going to tell you, okay. At the top, you'll see the name of the build file, which you can change with the command line option. And it will tell you the name of the properties file, which we're going to get into in quite a bit of detail as well. And then at the bottom, it tells you the status of the build and some timing information, so you can see how long it took to do your build. If you have a failing test, you'll see something more like this. Notice that it tells you the exit code, task exited with code 1. Unlike PHP, where we have exceptions and can have all kinds of failure states, Unix only really has, they use numbers to pass things back and forth. And if they use 0 as a failure state, then they can only have one failure state. So instead, they flipped it around. 0 is a success state, and the numbers could mean different things. So 1 could be a file not found, 2 could be a network not found, or whatever. Notice that there is a default attribute on your project. If you just run Phing from the command line with no arguments, it'll run that. I almost never do it that way because it's not that interesting to me. And I usually run different tasks every time I run Phing, because that's how I roll. My Phing files are very large, so I have lots of targets I can run. But if you don't set this, Phing will complain and not run, because it's a required attribute of your project. So you remember that check return attribute on PHP unit? What happens if you leave it off, or you set it to false? Well, in my opinion, the PHP unit task should fail to build if the task fails. Exec, however, does not do that. The native PHP unit one does. So that means that you have to add this extra attribute to just get sane behavior. I can think of a few times where you might want a task to be able to fail without failing your build. For instance, if you have a Jenkins job and you're building documentation, you might not want your whole build to fail just because PHP doc had a invalid attribute or annotation somewhere. But for the most part, I like my things to fail to build when they actually fail, so you always gotta add that. Again, the PHP unit task will fail to build if a task fails, but it's very limited in what you can configure. Here's a few things that it does not support. You can't turn on strict with command line argument, so you can't find assertions that or tests that don't have assertions. You can't turn on colors for pretty output. You can't add groups to target your tests better, and you can't pass in command line flags.
Something the native one has, the command line doesn't.
These are ones that the command line will let you do that the native one doesn't. You can set most of these through php.xml, like the strict and the colors, but it's really hard to target groups on the...
specify which ones you want.
Yeah. And I like groups because I think they're very nice. So I like to be able to include this exclude group or include group annotation so that I can kind of break down my tests into smoke or selenium or integration or whatever, however you want to break down the groups. So you can run just one group, or in this case, I want to run all of them except the integration ones because integration takes forever. I'm just doing unit or whatever. I also like to be able to pass in a flag so I can change things from the command line and change how it's running. This is really useful for like saying I want to run it on a single test file rather than all of them. So you can pass in a command line parameter to target just that one. So Phing wouldn't be very useful without some concept of state in the way of passing it around. Variables are what we normally think of. They call them properties in Phing. They're basically the same thing. And there's a few ways of setting them. So one way is with a property line in your build file. This is the most common way of doing it. This is useful for setting paths to executables or giving properties a sane default value. And there's a couple of ways of changing it from the developer's perspective. We'll talk a bit about how to do that as well. Another way is with this -d parameter. Yeah, it's ugly. That's the Java heritage for you. So in this case, we're trying to pass in this PHP unit flag and set it equal to -- group equals smoke. So it's ugly, but how are you going to do it? Another way is you can set them in a build.properties file. This one is probably the most useful for a developer to be able to set things up that are common configuration for the project. In this case, I have, this is from the build.properties file, and this bottom part is from the build.xml file. So we're setting 3 values at the top. We're telling it where it can find composer.far. We're telling it a username and a server URL for some server out there. Then we're going to run two execs on it. The first one basically just runs Composer to update your, install your Composer stuff. And then the second one actually SSHs into a machine to reboot Apache. And we'll talk about this kind of advanced Apache a bit later as
Is
well.
there any way to load properties from like a PHP file and execute some code to get some value? Or is it pretty static command
It's
line or file?
pretty static. If you had a custom task, you could include a PHP config file from there. And you could probably write a custom task that only loads from a config file. I may not be able to pass things back out to the, I don't know if that worked. But no, mainly you just have to use these simple, and the build.properties file is very simple. It's simple, name equals value. And you probably don't want that in your source control. You want to get ignored, or has to be ignored if you're old school. So, first things first about properties. They're immutable, except when they're not. So mostly they are. That make sense? All right, let's go through an example, because it's this made my head hurt, and the documentation is more or less wrong on this. So here we've got an example build.properties file and another build.xml file. So in this case, you might think that the stuff in build.properties is going to override the set these values. However, because we've already set author, it's going to stay set to other guy. It's not going to get changed to my name. But title gets set to Phing all the things, so this one doesn't actually take effect. So basically, whichever one gets there first is how it happens. So if your build.properties file is very first in the file, whatever's in there takes effect. If it's very last, nothing can get overridden. So as a developer of a build.xml file, or trying to set up the build, you can use this to say which ones are meant for the developers to override and which ones aren't. Now, there is one other option. They can then go in and use a command line parameter to reset author from the command line, and then that one comes first. So there's kind of scoping rules to how these things work. You probably will never run into this, but if you do, this will save you a lot of time if you just remember this, because that made my head hurt so bad. So any of y'all use PHP code sniffer? So for those of you that don't, it's a tool that scans your files and looks for things that you did wrong. They call them smells, code smells. It'll look through and try to find times if you're using tabs instead of spaces or vice versa, or combining them. It will yell at you. If you're using, you can say some files or some functions are not allowed, and it will flag those. Problem with that is if you run it across your entire project and you've got third-party libraries or, say, Composer dependencies, it'll run across those as well. And that's not very optimal. So we want to run it just on our stuff. One way to fix that is with file sets. So here's a whole lot of XML. Basically what this is doing is we've got a pattern set, and we call it files. And it's going to pick out everything in the project that ends in PHP, except for if it's in third-party or Composer's vendor directory. Then this target down here, PHP code sniffer, uses that pattern set to figure out which files it wants to run on. Yes?
Demo asterisk. That includes all subfolders.
It picks up, yeah, all subfolders and everything. So like this will recurse down into directories, where if you did just a single star, it would, I think. Pretty sure. That's how you do it. I don't know why. So this PHP code sniffer that uses this file set to figure out which files it wants to run on. Most of the native tasks like this for any of the static analysis tools, basically all the tools the Germans wrote to tell you you're doing it wrong, PHP code sniffer, PHP MD, PHP CBD, all of those can be used like this. And basically this will allow you to avoid running these things across a bunch of dependencies that you don't control and you don't particularly care about the style. So all the vendor stuff, which was written by someone you probably never met, and you don't really care that their style guide doesn't match yours because it's third-party stuff. So and then there's documentation. Anyone use PHP doc to actually generate documentation? I don't even write doc blocks.
I do sometimes.
So again, there is a native PHP document or two task that can do this. I'm going to talk about a few other things here, so I'm going to use this as another example. And documentation is a good example, isn't it, right? So first, note that you can do more than one thing in a target. So here we're going to make a directory, and then we're going to dump a bunch of documentation into that directory. You can add any number of tasks to a target, though like all the rest of the code that you write, you should refactor it to make sure that it's easy to understand, easy to read, easy to maintain. Otherwise no one else wants to touch your build file and your bus factor increases. Second, notice how we pass in arguments to the exec call. Everything in an arg value is actually already quoted, so the nice thing is that means you don't need to, say, add quotes around the title here because it has a space in it. The downside is that if you want to string together a bunch of commands, it really quickly looks really ugly. In case you're wondering, this actually tries to figure out if Selenium is running, and we'll set a property if it is. And you can then use this to decide not to start Selenium if you were going to run Selenium tests because it's already running. There's also argline, which in this case is a lot easier to read despite the fact that it's wrapping on the screen. The downside of that is you have to quote spaces yourself because these spaces, like right there, actually mean something important. So you'd have to, if you were going to do like that API documentation title tag.
You have to escape out the quote or use it for quote.
Yes, you could use single quotes. So also note that you have argline versus arg value, and unlike crossing the streams, which is bad unless it's good, argline and arg value just don't work together at all. They hate each other. They're like cats and dogs, and not the cool cartoon ones. They're the real ones that chase each other. So let's talk about dependencies. Phing allows targets to depend on other targets, and you can use this to kind of build up your project from very small pieces up to a complicated and powerful whole. There's two ways of calling another target. The first is with a depends attribute on a target. There's no real limit to how deep you nest these. You can have a dependency on another dependency on another dependency, though if you do it too much, you're going to end up with this, and you're not going to understand the dependency chain of your project, and it will be completely unmaintainable. So here's two targets that depend on others. The first one, build, doesn't do any work on its own. It just depends on a test target. So if you were to run build, it would run test, and if test were to succeed, then the build would succeed. If it failed, then the whole build would fail. The second one has a dependency on this require doc target, and if that runs and succeeds, then it will run the rest of the stuff. If that were to fail, none of the rest of the stuff would even get executed. So in this case, we're building HTML document or coverage from PHP unit, and we want somewhere to put it. And if you don't tell it where to put it, we want to fail the build. So here's that required doc target. Basically, it's just checking to see if you have a property defined somewhere, and that could be any of the three places that you normally can define a property. And it will fail the build if that property is not set. This is kind of a good example of how these properties don't actually need to always do work. They can just do logic or be able to build with a descriptive message. Really just however you need it to work. Other way of calling a task is with Phing call. The main difference between running things as a dependency and running things with Phing call is how they handle properties. So here we're going to try the exact same thing 3 times. We've got a target here that's going to call this other task in 3 different ways. The first one is with this depends. In this case, when this other task runs, foo is going to be set because it's set here. Bar will not be set at that point because nothing has ever defined it. Then we're going to call that exact same task through a Phing call, and we're going to include some properties in it. Now in this case, remember when I said properties are immutable, this one has its own scope. So in this case, foo will get set to test, and bar will be set. When that Phing call then exits, all of that stuff that had changed goes away and goes back to normal. So in this third one, we don't pass in any properties. So in this case, foo will be set to not test, and bar will be unset. the documentation on this is just plain wrong. It says that this is not how it works. That is how it works. You can try it. Any of y'all ever use make to compile stuff? So one of the nice things about make is that if you were to try to compile a bunch of object files from C source, it will look at it and figure out whether it actually needs to do any work. It's very lazy. And again, I like lazy. While in general, PHP never compiles stuff, there's always exceptions. If you've got less style sheets that you want to compile down to CSS, or you've got a JavaScript build that you want to run a minifier on or concatenate a bunch of stuff together, there's always exceptions that you might need a compilation step. Phing can do this with the up-to-date tag. It kind of does these conditional type tasks. So in this case, it's going to scan the styles directory, looking for any changed files. It's only going to look for files that have a less extension. It's then going to look at the modification time on each of those files and compare it to the modified timestamp of the most recent one against style.css. If style.css is newer than all of the source files, then it's going to set a property called CSS compiled. Then another target can use the unless attribute and see if it needs to do any work. So in this case, it's going to look at it's going to scan all the less files, see if the CSS file is newer. If the CSS file is the newest, it's going to set this property, and this target will never run. It'll just say, yeah, we're done. If you change the less file and run this, it's going to say, oh, we've got a newer less file than style.css. We're not going to set that attribute, and this will run and then compile all your CSS for you. Anyone not using Composer?
The last one, is it going to loop over everything, or is that just going to do the one? It seems like target is not in the scope of up-to-date. So is that just going to set one value?
So this up-to-date gets run when the build file is first initialized. So you've got 1,000 up-to-date file things. They're all going to run when you run your build. So when
only 50 of them aren't up-to-date.
Right. Well, so like when you first try to fire off your build file, even if you're not running this target, this property will get scanned and set. So when you try to run compile.css, this is guaranteed to have already run. So it will either have set the property or it will intentionally have not set the property. Did that answer your question?
So it sounds like it's going to check if any one file is not up to date.
Yes. Yes. If you have a single less file that is newer than your than style.css, it's going to set that property for you, or not set that property because it's up to date. So first time I gave this talk, it was about 50-50 in the room. Of course, with only 4 people in the room, it's much more likely that everyone is using the new hotness. But here's a target that's going to download Composer. And I apologize, I thought this screen was bigger. But only if it hasn't already been downloaded. So in this case, we're going to use this available property, and it's going to look for this file. And if that file is here, then it's going to set this Composer exists property. And this other target can then use that property with the, again, the unless thing to figure out if it needs to download composer.far. Then that get, so this get composer thing uses unless to decide whether it wants to download it. You can also install Phing via Composer rather than Composer via Phing, kind of a chicken or the egg problem. I normally install Phing system-wide and do Composer per checkout, just because you're more likely to get an up-to-date Composer by downloading it a bunch of times, because I always forget to do self-update, although I do have Phing tasks for that. The other thing is I'm really lazy, again, and I like to type Phing rather than vendor bin Phing, because I'm lazy. And another reason is you can use Phing on projects that aren't PHP, which means they don't need Composer, although you can use Composer for other projects. And finally, I don't see any reason to, if your only dependency is Phing, I don't see a reason to have all the Composer stuff just to download Phing when you can install it through Pair and have a system how to use it for everything. I've also used Phing for like JavaScript projects where Composer just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So finally, let's get to the meat of the talk, and let's deploy some software to a server. We're going to do this in a relatively platform agnostic way. So we're not going to use devs or RPMs or anything like that. If your server system is somewhat sane, this basic idea will work. If you're using Windows, I can't really help you. Hopefully nobody's using Windows for servers. So first, some assumptions. We're going to try to do most of our deployments with as little downtime as possible. Apparently users don't like it when your site goes down. We want to be able to roll back quickly in case something goes disastrously wrong. I'm going to assume you're all using Git for your version control. I will briefly touch on Subversion if you're old school like that. If you were to use a different thing, you could probably either use native task if one exists, or fall back to an exec target if you use like Perforce, or I think CVS has tasks, but I don't think Mercurial does. If you wanted to do it in Mercurial, you'd have to probably use exec native tasks. So to avoid real downtime, we're going to use symlinks. Get it? Link. It takes almost no time to create or move a symlink, so they're very, very fast. So you can compare that with like moving directories around, where you're shuffling bits back and forth. That can really kind of slow down your deployment process, which would give you some downtime. The problem is now you have to have Apache set up to follow symlinks, which isn't a big deal. It's a simple configuration issue. We want to be secure. So we're going to use SSH to log into servers. We're going to use SCP to push stuff up. I'm going to assume that you're as lazy as I am and you have good SSH keys and config files set up. If you've never used SSH keys, Google it, and that will make you so much happier. And that probably will that'll probably be the best thing you get out of this conference, is just being lazy like that. I've got lots of servers that I play with and can't remember passwords. I like to tag releases with a version number. I usually use semantic versioning 1.2.3 or whatever. I'm going to show you two different ways of tagging a Git repository with a version number that you pass in. The first is a little bit manual. The second one is much more automatic, but does have some problems. And we're going to combine the two and have a fully automated way without any problems, because I don't like problems and I'm lazy. So we've got a task called require version, which is very similar to that require doc task from earlier. Basically, it's just going to look to see if there's a require version, and I'll show that to you in a second. It looks almost identical. Assuming you install Phing with the version control Git dependency, you'll have this native Git tag and Git push tasks that you can use. So this is going to tag a repository with whatever's in version, and then push it up to your remote repository. And you can pass whatever you want in through the command line. For your version, you could say 1.2.3 if you like semantic versioning. You could say, Cool Charlie or Return of the Jedi. It doesn't matter. It doesn't care. None of that matters. It just has to have a version. Here's what you might see if you don't pass in a version. You'll see the build fails, and it will tell you you must pass in a version, tell you how to do it. I feel like this is a better experience for the user than just putting in junk. If you were to not include that required version and you didn't pass in a command line, it's going to use the native or the default value of the property, which is the name of the property. So you're going to tag your Git repository with $ curly brace version curly brace, which I don't think is very useful. In general, I like to avoid putting garbage into my repositories. Phing does also support an automagic incrementing version. It's got a version tag. The version tag takes 3 attributes. First one is release type, which can be major, minor, or bug fix. The file attribute holds the name of a file that you're going to store your version number in locally. So in this case, I'm using version.txt. That file either needs to be in your source control and thus maintained, or not in your source control, which means each developer is going to have their own copy of it, which means they're all going to get out of sync because they're not going to update it when they should. And I don't really like having just random files in my repository that don't really do anything. Anyway, when you run it, it's going to pull the version number out of that file. It's going to increment it however you told it to, whether it's going to update the major number, the minor number, or the bug fix number. And then it's going to stick it in this version property. And then you can use it like you would any other property anywhere else. After the version gets updated, we're going to stage it. And you can see get stuff, we're going to stage it, we're going to commit it, and then we're going to push it up, and then we're going to tag our repository. So now we've got a tagged version, we've got a version file. Yes, sir.
What happens if two separate developers, both their versions, I was wondering if they can both upload the same tagged version, or is it going to force them to pull back down? And
Git
then
will complain
update
about the
another
conflict
member?
and say you need to do a git pull before you can push.
And then will that then
The
tick
second
the version number up?
The second person will fail because they'll be trying to push a version that already exists,
Right.
and Git will kick that out and say, no, you can't do it. But it won't fail until it gets to this step.
Okay.
So they'd be able to just Git pull and all this other stuff would match. Unless one person was doing, a major and the other person was trying to do a minor. And it would probably just have conflicts, and one of them would then have to go over and hit the other developer in the head. So here's what the output might look like. In this case, I'm going to update from a minor, from a patch level of 0.0.1. I'm going to do a minor release, and you can see that Git figures out that, or Phing figures out that the next version, minor version after 0.0.1 is 0.1.0. So it does it automatically for you, which I think is pretty neat because automatic is awesome in that way. If you don't want to pass in things from the command line, you can set up a bunch of targets like this that say, if I type in release.major, it's going to do a major release. I just prefer to pass it in on the command line, because that's how I roll. For you subversive types, here's a very similar command in Subversion. It's not quite as pretty as get tagged, but then again, nothing in Subversion is as pretty as it is in Git. So it has to actually copy something from one place to another to do tags. If any of you remember Subversion, lots of copying things around, so it's going to copy it to this tags directory on the server. All right, so back to Git. That's the last Subversion, I promise. So let's say you want to be able to use the version task, but you don't want that pesky file hanging around. Oh, that looks just awful. I apologize. I used the wrong one. This is going to ask Git for the latest tag, because Git knows what it's doing. It knows what the latest tag is. Unfortunately, because of the way sorting works, you have to use this really ugly sort command to be able to sort on 3 periods, because otherwise you get 1.1.2 is higher than 1.1.11, because 2 comes in, because it's all alphabetical. So this is going to find that, and it's going to stick it into this latest version property. Then we're going to echo that out into a file, and then we're going to treat that file like the previous file we used. So we're going to use it in our version tag. Then once we've read it out, updated it, we're going to delete that file because we don't need it. We don't care about it. And then we're going to do the git tag and git push like we did before. This is an example of how you can do some really simple individual steps to get kind of complicated and complex behavior. So here's a fun.
So back to that last slide, if
Yep.
you already have like a 3.0, you're currently building a 2.x patch, is there a way to specify your current version? And
No, this will not work in that case. You would be able to.
because if you just built it out with a graph or something, everything above your current version or something.
Yeah. You could also pass in the latest version from the command line, and it will, because of how properties are immutable, this would not overwrite that version. So you'd be able to. So yeah, then it would push it out to this and increment it to.
So I guess instead of all this grep stuff, the latest version, you just want the current version in that case.
Yeah. Depending on what you're doing. Normally, I've never tried to do patches with this system, so yeah. All right. So here's a fun dependency for your release process. This actually pings Jenkins, and use Jenkins for your builds. This checks with Jenkins to see whether your build's broken or not. So it makes a curl call, and then it reads the status JSON that comes back from it, and it parses out to find the status. And if it is broken, then it won't let you do a deployment, which I think is pretty nice. You could obviously do a little bit more here. You could print out the name of the person who broke it, so you can go over and hit them with a clue back. I had found that like sending emails out about who broke the build is fun. Obviously, Jenkins is really meant to do that, but nothing changed the behavior of a carbon-based meat popsicle like public shaming. So here's our deployment task so far. Pretty simple. Each individual step makes sense. We require the user to pass it a release. We require the build to be green, and we tag the version. If I was going to write this in an actual build file, I would do it slightly different. These two requirements would just be a dependency on there, but they would very rapidly go off the side of this slide. So just for purely aesthetic reasons, I would do it a different way. It just makes more sense for requirements to be considered dependencies rather than actual tasks that you're running. So before we deploy to the server, we're going to build a tarball. I assume everyone knows what a tarball is. Basically just a compressed archive. Before we build that, we're going to get a clean checkout of code from our repository, and we're going to clone it, and we're going to remove some stuff from there. Like there's no reason to upload unit tests to your production server or the Git directory or build file, that kind of stuff. So you can remove all that stuff before pushing it up. So here's a prepare target. First, we're going to grab a clean clone, and this is going to keep you from deploying from your current repository where you may have some work in progress. So you may be editing happily along, doing your work, and your boss comes in, hey, we need to do another deployment. If you just immediately deploy from there, you're going to have that in progress work, and then when your coworkers look at the version tag, they download that and try to figure out what went wrong in production, and they're going to look at the file like, that error message doesn't make any sense. So this keeps you from doing that. So we're going to download we're going to do a git checkout, we're going to delete some tests, directories in the build file. Then we're going to tar it up, and we're going to compress it. We're going to delete the build directory that we just created. So our updated deployment is really starting to take shape. Already we've made our deployments much more repeatable and easier. If you stopped right here, now you have a tarball that you can then upload to the server and deploy however you're deploying stuff right now. Or, of course, we can continue to automate it. So next we have an upload target. This is going to upload stuff over SAP and then SSH in to uncompress it. There are native SSH and SCP tasks in Phing, but you have to install a PEPL extension to use them. And I don't like PEPL for anything other than Xdebug, really. So I don't do it that way. I just use the exact tasks. One thing you should keep in mind, though, if you're going to SSH into a server to do stuff and you need to use sudo to become root, it's going to ask you for your password unless you have passwords turned off on your production servers, which is probably not a good idea. If you do that, SSH runs without a sudo terminal, so you won't be able to type your password in. There's a -T argument that you would want to use to open a sudo terminal so you can sudo in. Try saying that 10 times fast. But at this point, we're going to SSH in, and we're going to change we're going to unpack it into a directory. At this point, you're going to have 2 directories with different version numbers with your entire application. Depending on how you have your app set up, you can then sanity check the old one. I'm sorry, the new one. And now we're almost there. Now we have another target added to our message list called upload. At this point, you might be tempted to have another part of that upload task to actually change the symlink to actually make the new version go live. I would caution you not to do that for one reason, making rollbacks easier. So, final step, we have a go live task. We're going to SSH back into the server. We're going to very quickly change the symlink. Again, this is almost instantaneous. The likelihood of a user caching your application in indeterminate state is pretty slim. This assumes that your web server is looking at var.www/app for your application. The nice thing is our old deployment is still there, it's just not linked, so we can go back to it anytime in the future. So now we've got, if you just run this, you have a new version of your application running on the server. Again, it's lots of simple, easy to understand individual targets that did some pretty cool stuff, I think. Now you need to sanity check it. So So run your smoke tests if you have any, open up the browser and start clicking around, however you do your normal stuff. If everything looks good, awesome. What if you notice a shiny problem in your shiny new build? Your build's not quite as shiny as you hoped. Well, since we split out that go live target out from the upload target, it's really easy to do a rollback. It accepts a version parameter. You just give it the previous version. Run that, and bam, you're back to your last known good version, because it just goes in and changes that symbol you need. So it's kind of a get out of jail free card, which can really save your, well, could save your job, to be honest. Any of y'all sysadmin or DevOpsy type of people? Throughout my career, I've worked with a lot of different sysadmin and DevOps types of people, and they all agree on one thing. If you're not monitoring it, it just plain doesn't exist. If your staging server doesn't fall within their monitoring software, they do not care about it. They will not fix problems on it. They will not answer emails about it. They just don't care about it. So they've always got these fancy monitoring systems. One of the nice things that you can do with, depending on your package, is you can mark a deployment in their package. So here we're going to build a custom task to mark a deployment in New Relic. Any of y'all use New Relic? New Relic's pretty awesome. It gives you lots of pretty graphs and keeps management happy. And it actually provides value for DevOps. Again, this could be done from an exec because it's just a simple curl, but we're going to build a custom task so that I can show you how to extend Phing and do lots more interesting things. Basically, in a custom task, you can do anything that you can think of with PHP, you can do as a Phing task. So all the power that you get with PHP, whether you're going to open sockets or whatever. That's with the file system. However you want to do it, you can do it in a Phing custom task. So we're going to mark a deployment on New Relic's system so that we can see the effect that a new deployment has on code base. Bless you. So here's an outline of an empty Phing task. Very simple. There's two methods that are, well, first one's optional, the second one is actually what does the work. The init method is going to get called when the Phing task is imported into your build file. And I'll show you what that means in a second. And then the main function is actually what gets called when you run your task. So what does that mean? Well, first you have to import it with this task def tag. And that's going to import a file called update new relic task.php from the current directory. And it's going to create a new task called New Relic. If you wanted to put things into directories, you could put the directories before this and separate them from the file with periods. So you can have namespace them or just get them out of your root directory. And then you'd be able to call it with New Relic. And you use it just like any other task that you might want to use. And if you wanted to pass in some data to your task, you would have to add setters to your custom task. In this case, the class will expect you to pass in a version. And we would pass that version in just like we would pass any other attribute in with an attribute, or any other property with an attribute tag, or attribute. All right, so to tag a deployment in New Relic, there's a few things we would need to give it. We would need to give it an application ID, which New Relic will provide. We need to give it the version, which we've already got. And we need an API key, which again, New Relic will do. So we set up all the curl stuff.
On that last slide, is maybe one before, is the task, is that defined by Phing?
Yes. Yeah.
Got it.
So there's all your standard curl options, and then we've got the rest of the curl stuff to finish out your curl call. So now this is an example of a New Relic dashboard. This is from my home server, which I don't get a whole lot of traffic there, which is why it looks like the data is not all that interesting. But you can see this line here is at 8:22 in the morning, deployed by Phing. I deployed version 1.2.4. And what you're going to look for here is if you're happily going along at a second per page load, and all of a sudden you deploy a new version, and that spikes up to 5 seconds for a page load, you know whatever you just deployed was wrong, and you need to go back, because otherwise your users are going to be very unhappy. If you were to try to deploy something that you thought was going to improve performance across the board, and you didn't see the changes, you may need to rethink whatever changes you just did because they're not working. I think New Relic's awesome, and I wish I could use it more. So we've got about 4 minutes left. Thank you. Please rate all your speakers. Go to Joined In. Every talk has it. I work for a battery out in beautiful San Francisco. We're always looking to hire awesome people. If you think you're an awesome person, let me know, or them. And all right, any questions?
So some of the main differences between this and the solve thing prefixes on commands.
Yeah, pretty much.
And everything else is probably about the same. Or you said
There are some case differences in the attributes, and it is case sensitive. So like check return in ant is all lowercase, and the R is uppercase in Phing, and it just doesn't work if you do it wrong. It like complains, so it's really annoying that way because they're not real differences. Yes.
So kind of coming into this without, having picked a horse to ride, I've looked at some of this Phing stuff, and this was fantastic. And I'm comparing that against some of the different kind of SaaS options that are coming out, like CodeShip or Travis CI, or some of these online ones that take care of a lot of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. If you were starting from scratch and had to learn something.
Well,
You obviously have a lot invested in Phing, so there's no reason to switch.
the whole reason that I got started in Phing is because we wanted to do deployments and we kept messing them up. I got sent out to California to deploy some of our software, and my manager handed me like this handwritten 17-point thing and said, do this. And I said, I'm not doing that more than once. So I automated it. So this is kind of how I did that. If I had a much better system to do it, or if I actually had a DevOps group, they would probably handle the actual deployments. I still use Phing all the time. Our current project doesn't actually have a build file checked in anywhere. I think I'm the only person in the company that uses it. But I can't remember how to run all the different stuff that we've got. I even have a Phing thing that runs Grunt. And Grunt's like basically the same tool. But I don't remember all the command line stuff that Grunt does. So I type Phing test, and it says, oh, you really mean Grunt test : whatever. But if I had whatever, would you say go
CodeShip is what I'm looking at. That does kind of.
I've never heard of it. But they do kind of the same end goal.
Yeah, I mean it's a testing through deployment, solution.
That sounds like less work, which means I would probably prefer it because I'm lazy.